Welcome to the Boston Art Podcast,
Boston's premier art podcast,
where we talk art, culture, and philosophy.
My name is Theodora Earthworms.
And I am Brian Huntress.
Welcome to the show. Hey guys, Theo and Brian here to provide some quick context for the upcoming episode.
What you're about to listen to is the first segment in a 7-part interview series we recorded this fall about an exhibition that is currently on view at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston.
The exhibition is titled Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas, and it is located on the 3rd floor of the Art of the Americas wing in the MFA.
This exhibition is included with general admission, so there is no extra cost to see it, and we highly recommend you check it out.
The first interview we're going to present to you was with Martina Tanga, a curator of the MFA's Art of the Americas collection. Martina was our original contact for this story, and she graciously introduced us to the other Touching Roots contributors.
We were able to talk to a bunch of the curators and artists involved in this exhibition, and for the sake of clarity, we are going to release these in chronological order, the order in which we recorded them, so you can learn with us.
Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy the show.
Yeah, sure. Cut off piano.
So you're doing it?
Yeah, sorry. I just want to,
All right.
just so we don't miss the good stuff.
We're wrong.
Right.
So the entire floor has had a changeover. Women Take the Floor was the last show up on the 3rd floor of the Art of the Americas, and that came down in November. The floor has sort of shifted gears a little bit, and so the side galleries, there are 6 of them, have returned to being permanent collection displays, which means that they will stay at more or less as they are for the next 5-6 years or something. And then the center gallery is a rotating exhibition space that will turn over about once a year.
Gotcha.
And the inaugural exhibition for the floor is Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies. But in a way, the whole floor is had a sort of sprucing up and kind of debut.
That's exciting.
Yeah. So the floor is the whole floor is called Stories Artists Tell. Right from the get-go, I'll draw your attention to the dual languages. So all the introductory text for all the rooms are in both English and Spanish.
Wow.
Not correlated, to thematic, everything is English and Spanish, regardless of Latin American or Spanish theme.
So is that, in terms of the dual languages, do you feel like that's new for museums to be doing?
I think the different museums are piloting different kind of approaches to it. We have had from talking more broadly from the Americas department, we had it at different ways of kind of testing this out, and beginning with the pandemic and then implemented last year, we had a translation project downstairs where we selected, I think, 6 artworks and worked with a team of internal staff members to the museum and selected a number, the most commonly spoken languages in Boston, and rewrote labels to reflect those languages. So then they're both in English and the other language.
Yeah. That must have been a huge project.
It was the one, what do you do when you're not on site and you're at home and you're Zooming? It was kind of something facilitated by the fact that, our regular jobs were interrupted, and this was something creative to what else, what could we do with the space without actually being in the space? So
it must be tough too, because in terms of artist titles and things like that, given that they weren't, given that the artist might have supplied their own text in their own language or for the title, did you guys find that it had, was there any kind of difficulty in the purity or accuracy of the translations?
So what happened was that the label wasn't just translated, it was co-written by a team around it. So it's sort of really going to the heart of it's not what was an English expression then copied into different. It was it came out of a different language, and then the English was copied from that. So it's like a revert, sort of like where the hierarchies of language are, it was really meant to dismantle that sense of like just a kind of
English being the primary.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but it goes to all those hearts of those questions, like certain terms, like how do you convey this in one language into another? Like it becomes very like knotty very quickly, and you can really get into the weeds of really like complicated things when you're sort of managing and playing with words. In this case, though. So that was the translation project, which you can see in the floors below. In this case, it was mostly English leading the kind of communication, and then also expressed in Spanish. But we played with the positioning of the language. So in some galleries, the English is on top, and in other languages, it's flipped to sort of really give a sense of the presentation and the welcome of the information in this gallery isn't like prioritizing one over the other.
And just to get a sense too of like who we're talking to in this episode, I guess too, like could you tell us about how you got started in curatorial work, or even at the MFA, or maybe even before that?
I can begin anyway.
Super broad question.
My name is Martina Tanga, and I've been working here since 2019. My primary responsibilities at the MFA is to manage a partnership between the museum and 4 regional museums called the Art Bridges Initiative. And it's a multi-phase, multi-exhibition initiative where fundamentally it's a sort of collection sharing partnership. And I can go into all of that, but it's sort of a little bit besides this. Anyway, let's go inside.
Yeah, I'd love to see more.
Yeah, I get so much just joy being in the space and in the gallery that is just ahead of you, and it sort of welcomes you with open arms. I feel like the openness was something very intentional.
Really?
So grounded in this intro space is a recent acquisition of the Art of the Americas department, this John Wilson maquette for the biggest sculpture that's outside of the National Center for African American Artists in Roxbury, called Eternal Presence. That sculpture's been there since, I think, the 1990s. This maquette is one of 2. There's another one at De Cordova. Was purchased from the Wilson estate by the museum. One that John Wilson talks about his time studying the MFA's collection, being inspired by the Olmec heads on his trip to Mexico, the Buddha heads here at the museum. So it's really intentionally placed like at a crossroads in the space, because it relates to so many different kind of cultures. He wanted to represent this sort of very African-American face, but one that was kind of emotionless, to really get to the sort of juxtaposition of like presence and eternity, like a very long stretch of time, and then like so the eternity of time, and then being in the present. So one that you couldn't play, that the kind of eternity bit is that you can't, it's not so like culturally specific, or it's, it's kind of like a sort of stand-in for humanity, and yet though it also references like the present moment today where we are, and it's so evocative of like racial conflict, like it does also point to like ground you in the present.
Right, and there's something about how just heavy and strong and placid it looks that truly it could be ancient.
Yeah, exactly. And he was also looking at like Yoruba masks, and this idea of like facial expression of like expressionless is relating to a coolness and a spirituality. So that's how I sort of also feel that it is part of Touching Roots. So it sort of welcomes you to the floor, it welcomes you to the museum, but it also welcomes you to the show behind.
Right. It's like
It's
you're
a really powerful first piece too. When you walk in, like it really captures your eye.
Yeah, it makes you stand to attention, you know, because it's like it's looking at you.
it's like being greeted by a deity.
Yeah, even though
You know?
there's a blankness to the eyes as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is a show, Touching Roots, and I want to say that's really important. I was thinking about this on my drive-in this morning. I worked with 4 brilliant collaborators on the exhibition, and I thought maybe I could share with you their contact information, and maybe you could have phone like I would love for the episode that you're working on to not just have my voice.
Yes.
Okay.
And to
That's
have
a wonderful
their
idea.
voice too. It's logistically hard to coordinate everyone like to be in this space at the same time. So I was like, well, maybe like there could be a follow-up recording of some sort.
I see.
You know?
Of course.
I think it's an excellent
Yeah.
idea. We'd love to do that.
Great. So this is a team, and I want to introduce you to them. Like first, sort of like right away, 2 artists: Stephen Hamilton, Napoleon Jones Henderson. Shanova Baker, who's a curator, an art historian, and Kiera Daniels, who's a scholar of like a religion and the African diaspora.
Wow.
And was really a co-curated show, like collaborative project, and one where the institution welcomed them in, and we really made all the choices that involve the show together. So I want to make sure that they're
It seems like an excellent team.
Center.
Yeah, we would absolutely love to talk to them. That sounds so exciting.
Yeah. Kira's just moved away. She used to be at Boston College. Now she's in Atlanta, Georgia, with a new tenure track position. So, but the team was also like purposefully like locally grounded, so we could see each other in person. The goals for the show is that this isn't, like looking to how Black artists of the Americas have looked to Africa. It's not a Boston story, but I wanted it to be grounded for Boston audiences. Like that was one of the goals of the exhibition, that it should speak to like this community specifically.
Right, like which is stated
like
in the
John Wilson.
So was he a Boston artist?
Boston artist, yeah.
Wow. And just to get a little more context, so the bronze head was a maquette for a larger sculpture. I'm afraid I haven't seen the one that he made in Roxbury.
Yeah, so it's just outside of the National Center for African American Art, which is led by Barry Gaither. It's an institution that was founded, I think, in the 50s by Elmer Lewis, this huge personality in Boston, massive advocate for Black artists in the city. Barry Gaither is this incredible curator who, and so, also important statement here is how this show builds on his legacy. He's the director of the National Center for African American Art, but he curated a number of shows here at the MFA. A groundbreaking show, Boston, New York, African American artists, and then subsequent ones through the 70s and 80s. And, he's just been a really incredible mover and shaker in the Boston community. And, so this show it's building on his legacy. It's not like this is an important show for the museum, but it's not a new, it's its own thing, but it's not just coming out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's coming out of a legacy.
What an excellent thing. So you said Gaither is the director of this museum.
Yeah.
And he was, what was the first name? He was Elma
Lewis. Yeah.
Okay. And how was she affiliated with that museum?
Well, so she founded it.
Okay, gotcha. Right. Sorry, I got a little...
that's okay. She founded it, and she was very, clever in securing its institutional prosperity by creating relationships with more established institutions like the MFA.
Right.
She was an incredible, savvy, cultural, leader, almost businesswoman,
right.
One of those forces of nature that, makes things happen, like materializes something
like
out
materializing
of
a museum.
Yeah.
That's no joke.
Yeah.
So
Around what time was this? It says 1969 to 2020. He was the director and curator.
Yeah,
There
so
was.
he's retiring. He's
Gotcha.
like, I think one of the things that the Boston communities should be aware of is like the types of like how to keep institutions like the NCAAA like alive and running. And this is like Boston history that sometimes like newcomers or the new generation like has no idea about all this, like the work that's been done. And so the importance of like, kind of for younger generations to like know about it so that they can like keep some sort of cyclical momentum going. It's not like,
you're right.
I'm not saying you shouldn't like build new stuff but like the things that have, been churning and moving in the city that like, because Barry Gaither is looking to retire, like someone needs to pick up those batons, and like keep that good work happening.
Well, what a huge thing for the MFA to be doing a show like directly representing like the work and legacy of an arts professional like him with a legacy like that. And so did, in terms of him being involved with this exhibition, did a lot of this work come from that museum or those collections?
So the NCAA has an amazing collection that needs like help being taken care of, and like plug in for like funders or supporters. Like I hope this show it does that, shines a light and gives visibility. Most of the artworks in this exhibition are MFA collection artworks. A few strategic loans to make sure that this is also a Boston story. And I'll point those out to you. They're mostly like artist loans to the show.
Wow, excellent.
But other than that, like the MFA has a rich collection to be able to tell this story. So one of the grounding like entryways for me to understand this subject matter, and for the Napoleon was like Loïs Mailou Jones, sort of like the grandmother of like Boston artists. She was a SMFA graduate. That's a portrait of someone else. Well, I'll get to that. But these three paintings are by her, and we kind of chart her career from the 30s, in the 60s, and then in the 70s, sort of slowly getting closer to the African continent, but also that sort of coming to know herself and like understanding her identity and what it means to her to be a black female artist in relationship to the African continent. But so she's an SMFA graduate. A lot of bios of her tell the story how she was looking for a job after she graduated, and she was racially discriminated against. She was told to go down south. She had a wonderful career at Howard University. Had a massive impact on like the subsequent generations of students down there. But she was from here, and she kept a studio in Martha's Vineyard. So though she didn't live here, she kept a relationship with artists in the area, and through like Paul Goodnight and Napoleon Jones Henderson, like she's had an impact on many generations of artists living here. So these three works are sort of set as an entryway for you to see the show, like to kind of ground yourself in her experience and her slowly sort of coming to understand her identity. It starts in the 30s when she had a Fulbright scholarship to go to Paris, and she was looking at, she was painting primarily in a realist technique at the time. She was visiting the Toledo Museum, like seeing African art in colonial museums in Europe, and also participating in a kind of Harlem Renaissance equivalent called the Negritude movement, based in Paris, but it was really quite international. A group of intellectuals, scholars, artists, poets, kind of theorizing and having these like decolonial discussions. This is a portrait of Jean Nadal, I can make sure you guys have the labels for everything.
That would be amazing.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, we have like press packets that I can get for you.
Excellent.
Or just send you via email. Anyway, so Jean Nadal and with her sister, the Nadal sisters, they used to host these salons. They used to host these meetings. And so I can imagine young Jones sort of like being in Paris, being overwhelmed by what Paris meant to any young artist in the 1930s, visiting these museums, looking at the presentation of African art in one context, and then also having these like hugely impactful discussions like on the other side, and sort of reckoning with like where do I situate myself in these discussions. And so she represents her as like this sort of thoughtful, it's a very intimate portrait, I think. One where she's sort of clad in like a shawl and like a beautiful headdress, but it's really close up. So she, it's sort of a one of like admiration, I think, of this figure, of this person. Kind of fast forward to the 1960s, so each moment as she's like traveling around the African diaspora, she has these like accelerated kind of pivotal moments of creativity, and she shifts gears. So in the 60s, and I we put this in a kind of circular way because it's not linear. She's sort of like moving around and like landing kind of like in her own center. But in the 60s, she travels to Haiti. She marries this artist called Pierre Noël, and she becomes very familiar with voodoo religion, which has West African origins. And what we're seeing here is a painting of the ritual landscape as seen from above that priests or priestesses draw using chalk on the floor. And these are veve, these are like spiritual symbols to invoke the spirits that get like stamped out and erased as the ritual unfolds. So it's like it has an ephemeral quality to it. And she, so starting to play with abstraction, or what looks like abstraction to us, but it's not actually abstraction.
It's representational.
It's really representational. But the symbols are kind of between abstract and representation because they have like signification that is, like outside of what you see. And she starts incorporating collage, like this paper mache, which is this like ephemeral material, more so than paint. So she has like, this kind of, she pivots dramatically and, and has this creative like output, kind of like new directions. And likewise, her travels to Africa in the 1970s spur on another kind of major shift in her work. She travels to many countries, she makes repeated trips in the 1970s, and she starts to play even more with collage. So she's incorporating two Pende masks that are kind of mirroring each other, only in outline. This Dan mask is like highly representational. This portrait of a girl from, a Thai girl from the Ubi region, which is the title of the piece. And then these symbols of like ancestral lineages, incorporating, as well as a more kind of sort of jazzy, like abstract design, which evokes some of her earliest work in like fabric design. So it's all coming together. It's all gelling in a kind of very powerful voice, artistic voice.
And the acrylic is like a huge, like, and beautiful leap from the 30s oil painting. Like this is this beautiful, popping, like, epic thing. And like, I'm interested too in the symbol in the bottom left. Does that kind of relate to the kind of like an infinite knot kind of?
Maybe, yeah. It's sort of something about kind of matriarchal lineages. And so she's thinking about like her rapport to Africa, like her ancestral lineage, all of these are connected, and they're really like she's grappling with fundamental questions of like identity. So we have in her work kind of entry points into themes that are like evoked throughout the galleries. the sort of main section here is sort of we balloon out into ancestral spirits, and this is something that was really came out of our working group together, like quite how powerful the ancestors' presence is in these works, and in the importance of African art and the relationship of like African art to artists working in the Americas, and the way those ideas of like connectivity, heritage, kind of a bond, like an identity bond, was never broken through the enslavement routes. That these things were kept very much like pulsing and alive in the Americas, and they are important connectors for understanding, who we are, and we can all relate to this because we all have a kind of like a lineage. We all come from somewhere, and understanding where that is like part of how we understand the world.
Do you feel like the theme of ancestry and lineage, was that something that you, the curatorial team, were finding kind of by accident in the work and like noticing this like story of ancestry, or did you guys set out to kind of create a show around the idea of lineage?
It's hard to kind of, through the messy beauty of conversations, hard to know like what came first, but like I knew it was there, but quite like how much prominence and how much to the foreground to put this was something that really came out of the conversations with the group. And it, we had discussions like the problematics of terms like religion, religion with a capital R is, kind of a dogmatic term, whereas like spirits and spirituality is much more kind of a diffused term, or term that more people can identify with. So things like that were really like eye-opening to me, like what terms to use when describing, the materials that we were dealing with.
In a way, the ambiguity of that almost lends itself to the inclusion of the exhibit.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the importance of like Jones on Boston-based artists. This is Aoife Franklin's work, for example. These two pieces are loaned to us by her collection, but she remembers Jones coming to the SMFA in the 1990s when she was a student, and just like the impact that Jones had on her work. These are two collages that are pretty sort of early on. She's an amazing interdisciplinary artist that works between performance and materiality and video and film. So she really does a lot of different mediums. But here she's collaging kind of the images that she's finding from the National Geographic and other kind of travel magazines, but subverting them, like taking ownership over them, finding those points of connection. Some of the title comes from this piece, like honoring spirits and touching roots. And they are different, like this is a Aoife oh god.
Tough words. Sure.
Yeah, divination tray.
Oh wow.
And she practices the religion of Egun, which is a very kind of ancient religion, a kind of you should talk to her because she'll explain this a lot better than I am.
We would love to.
But it's sort of like a foundational religion that other subsequent kind of spiritual practices have drawn out of, and she really describes it as her work is a calling, and the work flows through her, which is a very beautiful.
She's kind of a spiritual conduit for these ideas and themes coming through. And she's a contemporary Roxbury artist living in the city. That's awesome.
Yeah, she came and did some spotlight talks for Juneteenth, and
Oh, wonderful.
she held court here. Like she was holding like 40 people in this room. The like attention was like just like the kind of, you could hear a pin drop, like just like everyone was hanging on every word she was saying. It was just like amazing.
Wow.
But then I called her up and I was like, I'm going to put you between Jones and Willie Cole, and she was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe it.
What a dream.
For her, just like being here, like she's been practicing for 40 years in the city. Being here, being at the MFA is just like
legendary.
It's amazing. She's a product of the. She was, she studied right next door.
Yeah.
For all these artists, like it's a feeling of like arrival in some point.
It's like playing a show at the Garden. Or playing baseball at Fenway Park.
Exactly. This is like massive, and
it's a huge deal.
She is amazing. She totally deserves to be here. But it's also really touching to see those emotions.
Yeah. No, that's amazing.
Anyway, so Willie Cole here is looking at both kind of ethnographic photography and kind of the ritual ceremony of like invoking the spirits through performative, through masks. Like that's an elephant mask from Cameroon, for example, and that Napoleon Jones Henderson. So it's sort of like the channeling of the spirits through the body, and the scarification. So it has like this double, very like horrific connotations of slave trade, but also like the changing, the scarification of the body through like ritual practices for spiritual means. So it sort of has this double entendre, sort of double way of understanding it.
And in terms of, you said ethnographic photography, if I'm not mistaken, is that like the kind of like
colonial
pseudoscience of photographing?
Yeah, but also like the way like colonial enterprises try to understand the culturing of other. The figure 1, 2 is very like evoking a kind of ethnographic understanding of understand the mapping, the dominance, the kind of like categorizing of other cultures, and which is what the MFA, like museums do that. That's like the MFA is the encyclopedic museum par excellence. It's part of an Enlightenment project of like dominating the world, of like holding, like the legacy of the wonder, holding within its four walls, like the wonder, but also it's about like dominating. So
which is a very colonial thing.
Yeah.
So, and this artist recreated one of these, like, almost diagrams.
Well, I think he's playing on a number of different references, both flipping the past to gain kind of agency over what has been a practice of suppression, practice of oppression. So it's both. Yeah.
Wow.
So I don't know if we have time for everything, but I'll pinpoint. So,
we'd love to hear anything you want to show us.
So this is Napoleon Jones Henderson's piece. Again, it's another loan for the show. It was really important to me, bringing in artists to be co-collaborators. Like the best way we can represent them in the show and their contribution, apart from like, the work we've done together, is also to have their work here, part of the exhibition. So his work and Stephen Hamilton's pieces on the back wall, and those were loans. We have a Stephen Hamilton piece in our collection, but until I think it's coming down as we speak, the exhibition New Light.
Yes.
So the piece we own of his in the collection was displayed downstairs, and this opened in May. So it's like, well, we need something of yours in the show. So this is part of the same series that he lent to us. Napoleon's piece is a work he did in the 70s, and it fits so perfectly with the way that we're kind of capturing the African diaspora in this exhibition. So like Jones, who went to Haiti, he also traveled to Haiti in the 70s, and that's why this piece is interrupted. So it's a woven piece. He left and then came back and wanted to finish it, and started doing kind of more of what's called applique, so like putting other textiles together, thrift store shopping, and so it's sort of a piece that marks a kind of a shift in betweenness of his career. And the elephant mask is from Cameroon, and again one to use in ceremonial performances to evoke the spirits. One of them, really eye-opening discussions that I had with our group was, we had conversations of like, well, you're referencing African artworks, and we have a great collection of African art, at the MFA. Like, have you thought about bringing in some objects as a comparison, as a teaching tool? So we've done a lot of that in the labels, which you'll see. But I was very aware of the historiography of exhibitions and how badly that has gone. Case in point is the Primitivism show at MoMA in the mid 80s, I think 89. I'll find, we'll look up the exact date, but curated by William Rubin, and that was a comparison, pitching side by side European masters and African art.
Oh, and it was a disaster?
That was a total disaster.
Yeah.
There's a long context of why that was epic fail, primarily because Africa art was in the service. They're decontextualized and only in the service of explaining the European. So it was Eurocentric.
Yeah.
And I that just, it's so wrong. That felt like the antithesis of what this show was supposed to do.
Yeah.
So I was very wary of if we bring in other objects. But there is a case that we have done it here. So that's a preamble, sorry.
Gotcha.
Long one. So I was very hesitant, but people like Stephen Hamilton were it's a Western construction to think of the divisions between Africa and the Americas as being so divided by the Atlantic. This was a very permeable barrier. Information, knowledge, artworks, people, travel back and forth. It was a very integrated one. And so to sort of create that this division is somewhat arbitrary. So in this case, and it was very important then to make it a decolonial enterprise, is to, if you're bringing in objects, to treat them with respect and to give the same kind of attention to detail information about them as you would anything else. So these are Ashanti weights. We have quite a large number of them in the collection from Ghana, and they were used as in the economy as kind of to balance out gold dust. So it was sort of like a tool for exchange and the economy, but they took the form of figurative animals or symbols, like the double-head seated sword, a double-axed sword, the bird, or this is a little antelope, because they kind of held within them proverbs of better living, telling you how to live a more virtuous, truthful life. So they had a symbolic and spiritual function as well. And Hale Woodruff, working in the late 40s, he's often described in the American story of abstraction as working between realism and abstraction. There's a painting by him just round the corner for a couple of years earlier, and you can really see a stark difference in style. But it's called Ashanti image. He was looking at forms like Ashanti weights, evoking the idea of proverbs. So
I see.
Bringing them together, we can show what type of things he was looking at. We can show that these are not his; these are different. But they were common. They were common, everyday use items, and ones that he might have brought with him. Found these were relatively like kind of diffused. So he would have known them, and these are the types of things, and you can see like the forms, kind of appearing. So this is not a totally abstract image, just like the Joneses, voodoo,
The
painting
spiritual
is not
landscape.
an abstract image. It's actually like a specific thing, but in the language of like Western kind of moving towards sort of abstracting the forms.
That's really interesting because it has cultural context from two different perspectives. Like when looking at this from a Western perspective and not having this next to it or being familiar with these images, you would think it might just be shapes. But it's actually pretty representational, seeing them side by side.
One thing I love too about this is like I noticed that normally a label like that would say unknown artist. So so the artifacts the MFA is presenting that are by somebody unknown, is that so? I guess could you explain the change in nomenclature or phrasing?
It was important to the group. Like unknown artist puts the kind of like the who's responsible for not knowing. Like it's us. Like we don't know.
The encyclopedic museum
like
doesn't know.
That the person who made this beautiful like things, they were known to themselves, to their community. We don't know. Like it's taking responsibility for who's missing that piece of information.
Right.
It's not like it's just unknown. Like they were known, just not just no longer known to us.
And just for the listener, it says artist once known and no longer remembered.
In the place of where the artist's name would have been.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. This is a beautiful show.
This is,
I didn't know what to expect. I knew that it would be high level, obviously, just because it's the museum. You know what I mean? But this is absolutely
Thank you.
outstanding. So I'm curious too about the curatorial process. You said that a lot of the concepts and ideas and things included were the result of long conversations. Could you tell us like about those conversations and like how they were happening, and how long ago did this start being planned, like the process?
Well, so the idea came internally, came from me and like AOA staff, and I, but I want to make I want to point out that I'm a believer that maybe shows shouldn't just be born within and then like you find outside kind of collaborators. That the way things originate could be much more dynamic, and maybe they could originate from outside in, but that's not how museums usually operate.
Right, yeah.
So the concept like came out of the discussions about the whole floor and like what were the galleries going to be, as soon as like this idea gained traction, I wanted to do it with others. I didn't want to be solely authoring the exhibition. I also was fully aware of lacking fundamental expertise. I'm not an Africanist, my background, which is valuable to the show, but like I don't have expertise in everything, and that's fine. Admitting that like it's totally like cool.
It opens the door for more education.
Exactly. I've learned a ton. I'm so happy. But knowing how like I'm not an Africanist, I'm barely call myself an Americanist, and just also I'm a white curator. I'm not a black curator, and I don't have that sort of sensibility of like how this show really impacts and goes to the core of like identity. Like I understand it because I grapple with my own identity, but it's understanding how that I didn't want to speak for others. So I assembled this team. All these guys, like they already knew each other. I knew them individually, but like we came together as a group, and like I didn't quite know like the relationships that were pre-existing between the team that made it really like gel very quickly.
So you're pulling from your own network and bringing people on.
Yeah, but they all like had enormous respect for each other, enormous like pride and joy of working together. Like it just clicked very organically and quickly, and very humbled by their patience and their generosity as well with me, coming into the group. And we met only like 3 times, like for very like substantive and like in-depth conversations. The first one was getting to know each other and setting goals for the show. Like I didn't come to them with like a determined plan. I thought very carefully about like what the invitation should look like. And when you invite someone to work with you, you have to there has to be room for them to feel welcome.
Right, they don't want to feel like a
this is
spokesperson or a mascot or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it was really intentional to bring them together, and for our first session to discuss where we wanted to go with this show, and how we were going to get there together. It was always a question of together.
So what was the first idea versus what it built into? Like, what I guess came from those conversations compared to what the original question was when you brought them in?
I mean, the really big theme was like, and it kind of came out of my study of art history, and sort of like a real strong theme of Black artists of the Americas looking to Africa. It's like it's a lot of artists have been exploring that thematic. So that was like the big subject. How to organize, and I came with a big checklist. Like, these are the artworks that we have in the collection that fit this theme.
Yeah.
The question then was, how do we organize them? And how do we lay them out in space? And how do we draw out ideas to the forefront? Like, what's most important about telling the story? And so, like, the thematic groupings came out of those conversations. Like, we had a discussion about placing Jones together. Like, she could have been dispersed, and the focus couldn't have been on her. Like, she would have been in the show, but like, that she could, her works in the exhibition could have been separated out, or keeping them together. We had conversations about, like, as I sort of mentioned earlier, like why ancestral spirits are so like important. Like, I never forget, like, Ife in that talk at Juneteenth said, when the galleries are quiet, nobody's here. The ancestors are talking to each other. Like, these works embody like an ancestral spirit, and they come alive, almost like they're present here in this space, which is like, I don't know, beautiful, and sends like shivers
give you chills.
Yeah,
Seriously.
So the big questions, once we were all on board on like the show, but all these curatorial questions of like, okay, well, like how do we show, where do we position things, and what kind of ideas need to like really stand out, and how do we do that through the objects?
That's so interesting. That process, like how trying to make it into something that really resonates. And that's interesting thinking about workshopping it that way. I'm so excited to talk to the other people that are part of this project also.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, this is a beautiful exhibit.
Yeah. So, another like through line that became really important, like, was ways of knowing. So this little case here encapsulates artists in the 30s, like Africa in the imagination. So when artists didn't have the possibility of traveling to the continent, like Jones did later in the 70s, what were art, and Alain Locke was telling artists from the Harlem Renaissance period to look at those ancestral arts, to kind of look at arts made of Africa that belong to these artist lineages. Like, what were they looking at? Like, that they were studying art through books and artworks that were here, but like how were they grappling with the information that they were receiving? So this is more of a very like conscious way of connecting, using the intellectual mind and aesthetics and like, and then equally important in the exhibition, a kind of way of knowing that is usually underprivileged in places like museum settings are things like the G's Bend quilters and Mary Jackson's like the sweetgrass basket. These are ways of knowing and making that have been passed down through generations. Like, so you learn from your mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, and the quilting has roots in kente cloth strip weaving. For example, the idea of like getting strips and like composing, collaging together composition. And sweetgrass weaving too has its origins in West Africa. These traditions have thrived in the Americas, and they're a different way of knowing. They're not like studying, it's not like intellectualizing, it's more just like intuitive, like you've grown up with it. And these two ways of knowing exist, like unprivileging one over the other.
And something that's like an almost ancient craft that's been passed down almost through oral history would be a direct connection to ancestry.
Yeah.
To where we're, I was watching someone play violin one time, and I was just like, how did that person learn that? Like, how did someone from like the 1700s and 1600s playing the first violins trace all the way to this random person on the street? And it's just like a direct through line of knowledge, and it's the same with this quilt.
Yeah.
Wow. It's cool to see just a fiber art quilt next to all these paintings as well. I feel like that's pretty uncommon.
Right. So, blanking on the name of the Annie Mae Young. So, G's Bend has had its, kind of like its moment. It's had a number of exhibitions. They've toured like as a aesthetic and art making, subject and quality has had its like, has had visibility, but they've most often been relegated to like their own exhibiting within their own context, not really brought out into more thematic, more broader discussions. And like you said, unusual to see it next to different mediums because of the internal hierarchy of like mediums within the museum, like paintings at the top and like text, these are all like, again, like dismantling the sense of like hierarchies. And purposefully placed next to Romare Bearden, who's making strip collages, often talked about in relation to Cubism and like the Western canon. But he was also looking at different traditions, like the strip weaving, like Annie Mae Young. So,
you can see it. It looks quilted.
Yeah. So let's like reorient, his work so that it's placed within a different lineage, which is also, like part of his points of inspiration.
Kind of interesting. Is he also, or it seems like it might have been before the neo-expressionist time, but do people ever associate him with that kind of like pop art, modernist, expressionist movement as well?
Somewhat, but that, the pop art is like a very like, mostly like a white genre. Like it hasn't, it like the black art, again, like there's been a racial discrimination in the art historical kind of narrative.
Well, it's interesting too, talking about things like the sweetgrass basket or the quilt, and thinking about, I feel like something that I've heard before about curation in museums specifically is that craft is usually separated from quote unquote fine art, and thinking about legacy that's passed down through like the trauma of enslavement or not having access to like the same kind of education historically. Something like this has a lot of importance in terms of connecting with that legacy and that history. So it's nice to see it in the same space, but I guess I've never thought about that angle of it before. Another reason why I don't agree that craft should be separated anyway.
No, I know. But it takes so much work to dismantle those ways of like placing value systems.
Yeah.
Did you learn, Did you find yourself thinking in kind of a new paradigm during the process? Because like, probably by no fault of your own, you know what I mean? Like we're curators and museums and stuff are thinking and like are working in these kind of hierarchical systems or like different like random socially constructed difference between craft and art. Like, did you find yourself from the curatorial team and from the art like seeing like ways that you hadn't thought about it before?
Yeah, I mean, just the working together was completely eye-opening, and really spending time listening to my collaborators was it's a total privilege, and you know, yeah, and really just important to get outside of the ways we're so used to thinking. We've been taught to think. It's and doing it together felt really freeing as well.
It's really beautiful to see this kind of thought process in a space like this, like in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston also, because I think when you think about, people say all the time, like colleges don't lean into this history as much as they should, or museums don't lean into this as much as they should, or galleries don't. But then you think about like I'm thinking we have a lot of people that listen to our podcast that are going into art school or in art school, they're trying to break into this field. And where you're getting your information from, learning your history from, are those institutions that we're criticizing. And I guess maybe the best way to circumvent that is more collaboration with your community and people that have lived that history and are contributing to it currently before it's history, I guess.
And it's funny because I'm absolutely no curator, and I'm as far outside of the museum field as you can get. I'm not, you know what I mean? I have no idea what I'm talking about in regard to that. But I've heard that sentiment shared before, where it's like the museums need to get more involved with the communities or need to bring the community in more. And I think it's amazing to see this come together because I've sat down and thought about that a lot. And I'm like, if that were my job, I would be lost. Like I would have no idea where to start even, you know, so.
The how is, this is like the new challenge, and there's not that many precedents out there of how to do it successfully. But there are, if you look outside of community centers, there are different models to look at, but you have to sort of get outside of the usual, the places that you usually look to. Yeah.
Did you find it difficult working with the the machine and institution that is like a museum like the MFA? Like, did you find yourself like, I guess like it seems like doing something that might be that outside of the box or that far away from the normal routine and processes? Did you find yourself like in like complicated positions of almost not necessarily restriction, but like any pushback or kind of what am I trying to say? Like did people was anybody kind of like why are you doing it like this, or like this isn't normal? Why aren't you just curating the show like a curator?
I have felt really supportive in my department, with the internal. But it's interesting you asked that. So I've also somewhat benefited with internal transitions that have been happening. The MFA is really short-staffed, and there's been some turnover between coming out of post-pandemic. We had a program called Table of Voices, which we still do, but the leadership for that had a moment of change. So in a way, I also took advantage of a vacuum of kind of vetted institutional processes for working with outside collaborators. So there was a program in name, but nobody was giving me directives of how to engage with, with my team. And I think I'm a firm believer that it needs to be specific and driven. Those processes can never be top down, instrumentalized. They need to come organically from the project, and that's exactly what I was able to do with the group, because there was also a kind of a vacuum of kind of normal processes.
Yeah.
But internally, also very much supported.
That's wonderful.
by staff members, feeling that this was something the institution really needs.
How many other shows have you done at the MFA?
So this is my first here. The Art Bridges program means that I curate mostly collaborating with the regional museums in the Northeast.
Wonderful.
Very cool.
Yeah. Let me just, I'll point out a couple of
Please
other
do.
sections.
Yeah, we'd love to talk more.
So this is a 1960s, 70s moment, which is in dialogue with Africa in the imagination. This is when our artists were traveling to the African continent. The 1966 World's Festival of Negro Arts, for example, happened in Senegal. Coffee Bailey went to that. So it just allowed for a lot more kind of mobility for artists and sort of in-person connectivity. This sort of wall is held together by the colors of the Pan-African flag of red, green, and black. So there's a brilliant coherence, but we span the Americas with these 5 artworks, with Ruben Valentin, who was in Brazil, made this painting in Rome and also traveled to the African continent in the late 60s, 70s. Elizabeth Catlett, who was in Mexico, Alan Crite, who was here in Boston, and Coffee Bailey, who was from Chicago and traveled to the African continent. So we have this moment when artists of the Americas are looking to many African countries who are gaining independence. For the civil rights movement here, that must have looked like amazing. These countries kind of freeing themselves of colonial rule and being able to self-govern. It just must have looked like such a kind of that you wanted to sort of moments in history that you want to participate in, and thinking about how to do that here. How do we make such change in this country? Really invigorating.
Yeah, this painting's especially impressive. From across the room, I thought that it was a screen print.
Yeah.
But it's an acrylic work. It's
Yeah.
gorgeous up close.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And again, that kind of very human, intimate portrait. George Jackson, slightly looking away, very pensive. Reminds me a little bit of Jean Nadal or the John Wilson head, at the front.
Right. Wow.
This one here stands out to me as well because it looks almost like a comic panel.
Yeah, so he was making these kind of vignettes. He was looking at sculpture. These are sculptures in major collections like the Met and other places, well-known African sculptures, and drawing parallels and connections to people in his community in Roxbury. Kind of wanting to compress time, and not that these are ancient at all. Some of them are from the 20th century. But compress the sense of the geographical distance. Drawing parallel, saying we're connected with the same, which is something that Stephen Hamilton's doing in this piece called Dashorn as Sundiata Keita, who was a 13th century Mali emperor. We know about Charlemagne and all these Western big great rulers. Sundiata Keita wrote one of the first human rights Magna Charters, an incredible ruler. The kings of history that we should all know about, but we don't know about them because he's an African ruler, so he's been suppressed in our kind of global knowledge. But huge figures, and he's doing the same thing. He's taking local youngsters that he's worked with, Boston public schools, and superimposing their image, their figurative figure onto these historic figures, collapsing time and space by this sort of superimposition. It's sort of similar. This is like my family group. We've got like here, this like mother and child. This is a family portrait. The buffalo is the mother spirit, and the lion is the father spirit. So there's a family portrait. And then the Romeo Bearden over there is also called like family.
Oh, I can see that now.
Yeah.
From over here.
So it's two figures and a baby in the middle. And so it goes back to this idea of like kinship and lineage and chosen family, as opposed to the lineages of kinship were the very things that ground you, make you who you are, that the slave trade fought so strongly to dismantle. And yet though they these bonds are unbreakable.
How did you guys handle the challenge of, all of these artists and even the historical pieces being from so many different countries, which I imagine would mean that they also involved a lot of different spiritualities and background practices.
Yeah.
How did you guys approach the differences?
Being as culturally specific as possible. Kira, for example, was very instrumental at making sure that Orisha, spirit, is written 3 different ways, depending on where you are geographically. South America, Central America. So it's sort of like getting that right is what makes anyone from from Haiti come here and say, like, I'm seen because you've got my spelling correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this painting back here is absolutely beautiful.
So it's sort of all one, but this sort of grouping is about dance and performance. In all the ceremonies, spiritual ceremonies, dance is a hugely important factor. So it's not separated from the piece, from the center, but it's sort of spatially it sort of creates a sort of unique grouping. Brian Mcfarlane, I also want to shout out to him. He's another artist, been working in the Boston area for 40 years, has never had a show here at the MFA or had work represented here. He's from Jamaica, and his family's from Ghana. So he took a trip, this is from 88, so when he was somewhat, young, to Ghana, and this painting is a reflection of a spiritual dance dedicated to the Orisha of water, the goddess of water, which is coming out of this sort of platform. He's included kente cloth, that was, the top strip was given to him by his godmother, which is again another connector to family lineages. Often it's encoded with specific compositional meaning, and then the masks that are kind of floating in the composition evoke various different ancestral spirits. Paired with Eldazir Couture, Chicago-based artist whose wife was a dancer, and the dance and rhythms of the black church with the white dress, and also evoking patterns of textile patterns and indigo cloth in the designs. And sort of we come full circle with Jones again. I kind of put this near the back of the exhibition. It's another work from her from the 70s, when she really finds her voice, and it's a portrait of Josephine Baker, who she saw perform in Paris in the 30s when she was on that Fulbright scholarship. Wrote home to her mum saying, this is amazing, I've just seen this artist perform, and I think she was just inspired by her agency, her stage presence, her confidence, all these things that Jones was still working out at the beginning of her career. Baker dies in the 70s, and I see this as a posthumous kind of honoring of her. When Jones felt confident enough to be an artist, with a voice that could match Baker's, and then paint her portrait almost like a dialogue of equals. So she's prancing across the stage in these 3 silhouettes, and again, the pende masks, the fabric design, the skirts that she was like famous for, in these like banana skirts and collage. So we sort of come full circle with her here at the end.
Right, this kind of biographical arc. Yeah, what a beautiful thing to kind of mirror her own artistry into the confidence and magnitude of a performer that probably had such a massive impression on her.
What a wonderful opening too for the top floor. This would be the first thing you walk into in the space.
Thank you.
It's really beautiful. Thank you so much for giving us the context as well.
Yeah. I'll make sure you have the labels, and then I'll put you in touch with a follow-up email with the group, and you can then reach out to them individually and schedule a time to have a
we
chat
would
on
love
the
to.
phone.
That'd be amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know you said a lot of the artists that are still around too, I know a lot of artists don't like to do things like this or talk a lot, some of them, but I mean, if there are any you think might be interested in talking to us for the story as well, that you might be in touch with, we'd love to make the trip.
Absolutely.
So
sounds good, yeah.
But yeah, I guess we can wrap up this portion of it. So thank you for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Wow.
Yeah.
That was Martina Tanga, curator of the Museum of Fine Arts Art of the Americas collection, walking us through the exhibition Touching Roots: Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas. This exhibition will be on view until May 21st of 2023.
And thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week for the second episode in this 7-part series only on Boston Art Podcast. Oh, and we definitely have to give a special shout out to Joel Mangian of Black Market Therapy for the additional audio editing on this episode. Thank you.
The MFA has multiple options for free and discounted general admission, including the Massachusetts Card to Culture program for EBT and Connector Care cardholders, the Blue Star Museum program for active military and veterans, the Bank of America Museums on Us program, applicable only on the first full weekend of the month, discounts with ID for K-12 educators in New England, discounts offered through a code you can obtain at your local public library, and discounts for students and faculty at participating colleges and universities in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. If you don't qualify for any of these discounts, keep an eye out for open house events when the MFA offers free general admission on community days. The next scheduled open house events are October 10th for Indigenous Peoples Day and October 30th. General admission at full price is $27 per adult and $10 per youth age 7 to 17. Boston Art Podcast is an independent DIY production by Brian Huntress and Theodora Earthworms. The information contained in this episode represents the views and opinions of the original creators or our guests, and does not represent any institution, organization, or business. Find us on Instagram at Boston Art Podcast, and tune in for a new episode every Friday. Thank you for listening.